Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Today's public lecture is the Foundation for Critical Thought and Artificial Intelligence. Zammit works in the education sector, currently pursuing a doctorate in philosophy at the University of Malta. His research explores the political role and ideological formulation of critical thought and builds a critique of this through an engagement with continental and Italian philosophy. Organizing committee and conveners of WIPSS works in progress in the social studies and the engaging in the annual international conference. Francois is also teaching assistant in the Department of Educational Studies and the Department of Philosophy at the University of Malta. His lecturing and research focus on political philosophy and technology. So thank you very much, and over to you, Mr. Zammit.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the Malta Classics Association for this opportunity. It is a great honor for me to be under your patronage for something like this. And I would also like to thank the audience for taking their time to listen to this lecture. Okay, so the title that I chose is Civil Strife as the Foundation of Classical Greek Political Philosophy. Now, and therefore the aim will be twofold. First of all, to explore the concept of the polis and why we need to explore it a bit more if we want to understand classical Greek philosophy. And furthermore, to understand this concept of civil strife within the polis. Civil strife, which we'll be defining as stasis, the term stasis. So it will be moving in this direction. Okay, so first of all, the polis. What do we understand by the polis? So Plato describes the Greek polis as frogs surrounding a pond. So I quote Plato from the Phaedo, quote, "I believe that the earth is very large and that we who dwell between the pillars of Hercules and the river Phasis live in a small part of it about the sea, like ants or frogs about a pond, and that many other people live in many other such regions," close quote. This metaphor shows how the Mediterranean Sea was perceived as an enclosed space, separated and at the same time separating, but also uniting Hellenic culture. A notion which can be also compared to a certain extent to the Roman concept of the mare nostrum. So in other words, these frogs that surround the pond can be said to represent not only individual persons, but are also representative of the various Greek polis that were founded and thrived all along the shores of the Mediterranean and beyond, for example, the Black Sea. Through the process of founding colonies, the Greek polis succeeded in turning the sea into a highway, allowing for the flourishing of trade and migration. At the same time, the trade of ideas and the development of ideas and inventions. So during the Greek classical period, all right, which we understand as between the 5th and 4th centuries BC, the polis becomes the structure, all right, the main structure found among the Greeks, all right? So we have this idea of the polis, which many translate as city-state, all right? But we will be exploring this idea. So although the polis function in different ways, have different forms of government, however, the polis, all right, is the main political structure. So we do not have empires, we do not have, all right, we have these structures, the polis. So these cities are self-governing, independent from each other, and administered in a diversity of ways, ranging from one-man rule to a select few, or a government run by the many. Sometimes, as in the case of Sparta, we have a mix of the three. The polis, which is a social institution closely associated as an essential aspect of Greek cultural life, therefore was considered as a natural characteristic of Greek life by authors like Plato and Aristotle. Thus, we have Plato comparing human gregariousness and the way it organizes itself similar to the way bees organize themselves in a beehive. Therefore, it is a natural instinct in humans, or at least in the Greek persona. Right? Similarly, we have Aristotle stating in the Politics, and I quote, "It is evident that the polis belongs to the class of things that exist by nature, and that man is by nature a political animal." Close quote. It is therefore evident that the polis forms the basis of the political philosophy that dominates the Greek classical world. Which leads us to a very important question. What is the polis? The polis is popularly defined as a city-state. However, I shall argue that this definition is terribly imprecise. In fact, I shall argue that the polis is neither a city nor a state. As H.D.F. Kitto explains in his book, The Greeks, the term polis originally referred to the citadel or the stronghold that was built to serve the community as a safe place and as a defensive bulwark against the enemies of the community. Over time, this same term, polis, came to refer to the very people who used the stronghold and not the structure itself. Furthermore, this concept then developed to mean the political center of the community. Therefore, as Kitto further explains, Athens, we take the example of Athens, Athens is the political center of the territory known as Attica, all right, a territory which also included the Piraeus and other adjoining villages, and said territory was inhabited by the Athenians. All right, so the Athenians are a people which are identified with their polis, which is known as Athens, because Athens was the political center. All right, so although they might not have lived in the city, but they lived, for example, at the Piraeus, all right, they would still be called Athenians because Athens is the political center. We see, all right, this, for example, in Plato's dialogue, The Republic, right, whereby we have the initial setting, right, happening on the way between the Piraeus and Athens, all right? So we have this territoriality being shown by Plato himself. Therefore, the polis represents the territory of a particular people, right? So if the polis represents the territory of a particular people, then we can safely say that the polis is not a city per se, all right? It's more than the city. It's a political center, but it's not a city. So much so that in Sophocles' Antigone, any reference made to the polis, either by Creon or other characters like Haemon, they are not referring to the city or the territory, right? But to the people who inhabit the territory. Any reference to Thebes is, in actual fact, a reference to the Thebans. This, therefore, implies that we can define the polis as the community. All right? So the polis is identifiable with the people, the community. The polis as community is a key concept because it explains what Greek authors had in mind when they developed their political works and their commentaries. It is not a coincidence that in the Republic, Plato argues that the polis must not be larger than 5,000 citizens, or that Aristotle in his Politics states that the polis must be the size that allows every citizen to know each other by sight. These are not fantasies created by Plato or Aristotle. Plato and Aristotle are describing the social realities that they inhabited. This is important to note, all right? And here, it is also important to note that when we are mentioning these numbers, we are referring to citizens, not population, all right? So there is these two distinct concepts. You have the citizens and you have the population. So as Kitto remarks, all right, if we are looking then at the population, we have to add the women, the children, the slaves, and resident foreigners. So when looking at the total population of the polis, then we need to also add these individuals. Thus, all right, if we are to loosely follow Kitto's example, 5,000 citizens, all right, each with one wife and 4 children, implies a local population of around 30,000 individuals. Now, if each citizen owned 1 slave and we add an equal number of foreign residents, the number will grow to 40,000 at the least. If we take a concrete example, at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, Athens had more than 20,000 citizens and a population of 350,000. This, all right, was considered as an exception and not the rule. Other polis were smaller or at times much smaller and limited in population size. Therefore, this is an important notion, especially when we are interpreting the political philosophy of authors like Plato and Aristotle. We need to understand that in their mind, they had a very specific concept of what political entity they are looking at. The element of size is a key aspect in understanding what the polis is, and therefore what, by extension, politics meant for the Greeks. A population that is too small, as Aristotle himself states, cannot be considered a polis because it cannot be self-sufficient. Furthermore, a very small population would be forming a nuclear community, or more closely to what we call an oikos, a household. However, a polis that is too large cannot be considered a community. A very large population, like the ones we find in contemporary nation states, lack the cohesion, unity, identity, and social relations that are associated with a community. Therefore, size matters if we want to understand the pre-Hellenistic Greek political mind. And I'm making reference here to the pre-Hellenistic because obviously then we are looking at the concept of empire, all right, with Alexander and his successors. So that is the first part. The second part of the definition associated with polis is state. And here we will be exploring this notion now. So Kitto explains that the Greeks would not respond to the notion of helping and supporting the state as we contemporaries or the modern mind would understand. And this is understandable even to the contemporary mind. If I am asked to contribute for the upkeep of my neighborhood, all right, or to contribute to see the quality of life of my neighbors or the well-being of my locality to improve, that is one thing. However, if I am asked to make sacrifices for an intangible institution like the state, or to contribute towards something that has no bearing on me, all right, for example, the defense of a part of the state which has got no relation to me, that would be another thing. So the state is a different concept to my union, for example, to my neighborhood or to my local community. Similarly, for the Greeks, this is what polis meant. Polis is their community. It is their neighborhood. It is the lands that they can see, all right? That they have a tangible contact with, all right? Therefore, the concept of state as an intangible institution does not apply to the Greek mind. This is also suggested by authors like Nicole Laurent and Giorgio Agamben, who basically look at the transition from oikonomia to polis, okay, who argue that the transition from oikonomia to polis is less drastic, less of a cut than we generally tend to think. Oikos, the household, is considered by Aristotle as the first form of community. And he therefore defines oikonomia as management of the household. He, in his politics, he emphasizes that the role of the polis is different from that of the household, and that more importantly, the administration of the polis is different from that of the household. Thus, the politikos, or if we have to define it, statesman, in a certain sense, must behave differently than the master of the household. However, in a close-knit community like the polis, right, how much of a detachment can there truly exist between the oikos and the polis? How possible is it to completely remove the interest of one's family and one's lineage and instead only care about the polis? And it is therefore this kind of tension that is revealed in the works of Greek authors, for example, in Sophocles' Antigone. Here we can see that Creon is placed in a very difficult position, whereby he has to rule in favor of the polis and against his oikos, against his family. And on the other hand, we have Antigone and Haemon challenging Creon's policy. So though on one hand, on one level, we may read Antigone's antagonism as a defense of the law of the gods, we must also read her actions, more importantly, as an honoring of her family duties, her oikonomic duties. Thus, in his work, Sophocles is uncovering one of the salient points, that shows the tensions that exist within the polis, within the community. The tension between the will of the polis and the will of the oikos. Laurent, in her essay titled La guerre dans la famille, War in the Family, argues that civil war in the polis is the result of clashes in the household or clashes between households. Blood ties and kinship give rise to conflicts and grudges that force the inhabitants of the polis to take sides. So much so that we associate a law decreed by Solon to be that no one can be neutral and that everyone must take sides. Therefore, stasis, all right, stasis takes also this connotation of taking sides, picking sides. And when people pick sides, this implies conflict. This implies that there is tension. This implies a struggle. In fact, we find that in his work, Plato is aware of this underlying tension. In a certain sense, when reading the Republic, we can argue that this tension, this inner strife that exists within the polis, is something that is constantly informing Plato's work. So much so that one of the things that Plato does is that he eliminates the oikos. Plato is so aware of the tension that the oikos creates within the polis that he eliminates the oikos from the guardian classes. And here I quote from the Republic. Our men and women guardians should be forbidden by law to live together in separate households, and all the women should be common to all the men. Similarly, children should be held in common, and no parent should know its child or child its parent. Close quote. Right? So, for Plato, this tension that exists as a result of the existence of the oikos is so prevalent, is so dominant, that his solution is to eliminate the oikos. Similarly, we can also find actual practices in certain polis whereby they recreate or redesign the oikos. So Laurent, for example, mentions the case of Nacone in Sicily, whereby they had the practice of creating adelphoi hieretoi, which can be translated as fictional kinships or fictional relations, where basically to remove the tensions, to remove the grudges, to remove the struggles between the various kinships, they, in Nacone, they had the practice of using lots to randomly allocate new kinships. So citizens would be drawn by lots and created into new fictional groups, and their allegiance would be a new allegiance. This practice allowed the inhabitants of Nacone to eliminate any blood feuds that might have existed, because now these blood ties are no longer existing. Blood feuds can only exist as long as the blood tie exists. Once you forget that blood tie, once you eliminate the blood feud is also cancelled. Therefore, what the Naconians were practicing is that they were effectively redrawing lines of kinship in such a way that the citizen's point of reference is the polis and not the oikos. So just like Plato, by eliminating the oikos for his guardians, their loyalty was all towards the polis and not towards their families. Similarly, some polis would enact such traditions or institutions like Nacone to ensure that the main loyalty is towards the polis, so that forms of eruption of conflict would be calmed down and possibly removed. So if I had to recap a little bit, so until now, I have argued that the polis is not a city per se, but a community. And we have also seen that since it is a community, this implies that the polis must not be seen as a superseding of the household, all right? But in actual fact, all right, we can see that the polis is a community within which you have a number of households. We have therefore identified the possibility that the existence of the oikos within the polis is the actual reason why tensions and conflicts exist in the polis. Therefore, from here it is important to further emphasize or further explore why the polis is not a state, at least not a state in the modern sense, and how this very concept of not a state is why stasis in actual fact exists and plays such a crucial role. So we have already established that the kind of relationship and attitude of the citizens towards the polis is not the same as that of modern citizens towards the modern state. When asked to defend the polis, the citizenry, the Greek citizenry, knew exactly what they were defending, which lands they were defending, who they were fighting for, and why they were fighting for. They had a tangible understanding of what was at stake. But this is not the only reason why the polis is not a state. Right? In a certain sense, we can therefore argue that the polis is a stateless community. Aristotle, in his Politics, identifies the polis as, I quote, a species of association, close quote. Therefore, defining the polis as a form of community with a common goal. So we had to take Ferdinand Toni's concept of association. It is a community with a common goal. And we can argue that the polis is such a type of community. And here I quote again from Aristotle, quote, all associations come into being for the sake of some good, close quote. Furthermore, Aristotle argues that the polis, quote, exists for the sake of a good life, close quote. So here we can see that the polis has a nurturing role that we normally associate with the oikos, with the family. But here, the polis takes that role and expands it further. This idea, if we accept Aristotle's definition of the polis, therefore, we can safely argue that this notion is very different to what the modern state is. Furthermore, there are many more arguments for this idea that the Greek polis is not a state. First of all, Greek polis did not contain the type of institutions that we associate with the modern state. Yes, within the polis, there were officials and official titles like the archons. However, within the polis, we did not have executive forces like a police force, nor did most polis, except for a few individual exceptions like Sparta, have a standing army. All right? So a standing army and a police force are two institutions that we associate with the modern state. And it is something that the polis did not have. In fact, when we talk about an army, what would happen is that the citizens would be called to arms, and it would be their individual duty to pick up arms, unite, and confront the enemy. In addition, it was the citizens themselves who had the responsibility of arming themselves depending on their financial means. Furthermore, if we had to adopt Max Weber's and Walter Benjamin's definition of a state, then we realize that the polis is not a state at all. Both Weber and Benjamin define the state as a political entity that claims a monopoly on violence. Therefore, the state, according to Weber and Benjamin, all right, through its institutions like the executive and the military, the state claims full control of violence and will institute coercive apparatus that will stop any of its members from having access to violence. Now, authors like Moshe Berendt and Laurent show that the police had no monopoly or monopolistic claim over violence, and that the citizens or the oikos had the potential and the ability to enact forms of violence on other members of the police, if they felt justified. Now, this would happen either between members of the same oikos or between members of different oikos. Such an example is, for example, the populist revolt that was led by Pisistratus and the turbulent times that followed his rule and his family's rule. And it is this kind of conflict, this kind of potential of eruption to violence that we are therefore defining as stasis. Stasis is an inner tension that exists within the polis like a potential energy that is ready to erupt at any given point. Berendt, in fact, defines stasis as, all right, there are a number of definitions that can be applied. We can define stasis as affection, we can define stasis as civil war, and we can also define stasis as a political standing, which therefore we can link again to the concept of stasis as taking a stand, taking sides. Agamben, in his work, places most emphasis on the concept of civil war. And he argues that stasis should be considered as a type of political paradigm, right? So much so that stasis, civil war, becomes a defining concept that lies at the bottom of a number of political theories like Plato and, in the future, other authors like Thomas Hobbes. Laurent, who associates the tension created by stasis to the fact that the oikonomia has a potential for violence, all right? So it's not only the polis does not have a monopoly on violence, but the oikos has the potential for violence as well. Laurent defines stasis as a form of oikos polemos, a war within the household. So here we can see that if the household in itself, there is a struggle within the household, this will also affect the polis. And also there is the idea that in a certain sense, the polis is such a close community that one can look at it as some form of extended household. So polemos, right, can also be read not only as war, but also as a form of struggle and opposition. So here we can see that stasis and polemos are two defining aspects of Greek political thought, because you have this tension, this strife, this struggle now not between the polis and outsiders, but within the polis itself. And this kind of concept is very prevalent in Plato's Republic. So Plato, in his ideation, in his formulation of the state, what he does is he compares it to the soul, the psyche. So for him, the psyche is a representation, an analogy of the state. So for Plato, the psyche, the soul, is represented by three parts: reason, spirit, and the appetites. Similarly, for him, the state, the polis, should also be represented by these three parts, whereby the ruler should be reason, and then you have the guardians representing spirit, bravery, but also a propensity towards anger, incorrectly shown, and then we have the population, that's the producers, who are identifiable with the appetites, with the reasons. In the Phaedrus, we have the analogy of the chariot. And this chariot does not only represent the psyche, but it also represents the state. In the chariot, we have the charioteer, who represents reason. We have the white horse, who represents spirit. And then we have the black horse, who represents appetite, who represents desire. But more importantly, what is key in this aspect of the analogy is the idea that the two drives, the two horses, right? They are the motor, they are the engine that makes the chariot move forward, that makes the state, the polis, thrive. However, they are conflicting with each other. They are conflicting with each other. And if the ruler, reason, cannot control them, what happens is that everything stalls. Everything stalls. And this is exactly what Plato understands by civil war. If you have civil war, so you have the bickering horses, which are uncontrollable, this will create a stalling of the progression of the polis. This will create conflict within the polis, which implies a degeneration of the very polis itself. So much so that we have authors, commentators like Nicholas Papas, who also compare Plato's idea of the psyche, right, and his understanding of the polis in these terms to the Freudian concept of neurosis. So for Papas, we have the concept of the id, ego, and superego, which can also be attributed to the tripartite soul, the tripartite psyche, as understood by Plato, and that therefore, if you have this uncontrollable conflict between the parts within the soul, right, what this leads to is the idea that you have a neurosis, which, as we all know, neurosis is considered an illness, a sickness, something that needs to be cured, something that is destructive, right? Something that destroys the person. So civil strife, civil war, civil conflict, civil struggle between the different parts of the polis, be they different households or different social classes, so we can have a horizontal or a vertical kind of struggle, implies a sickness, implies that the polis is tarnished, is losing its very soul, if we want to use Plato's concept. Similarly, we can also make reference to the analogy of the ship in the Republic, whereby we can argue that the sailors who try to take control of the ship from the captain are also representative of the citizens, of the population of the polis who want to take control, right? Not because of to take control out of their interest as an oikos, their interest as a lineage, or out of their self-interest. And that what that leads to is basically that the ship will wreck itself. And this is for Plato representative of the various revolts, the various civil conflicts that happened within Athens during its struggle. To further emphasize this idea of civil strife as a main preoccupation in Plato's work, we can also make reference to his book 9 in the Republic, whereby we have the idea of we're looking at the soul, all right, different types of souls, different types of seekers, whereby, all right, these are representative of different forms of states. And what is interesting is that we have this idea that, so the transition from one form of state to the other, so the transition from an aristocracy towards a democracy, for example, and then towards a tyranny, is that basically you have these conflicts where the non-rational part, the non-reasoning part takes control. But basically, but what Plato identifies more importantly in our discussion here is what Plato is seeing is that it is civil strife and not external war, not external conflict that leads towards the very degeneration of the polis. And it is here that we can see how this idea of stasis, of civil war, can be therefore considered as a political paradigm that informs a number of political theories, especially classical theories like Plato and Aristotle, and then other more modern theories like Hobbes, and whereby for them, the most important notion for a successful political entity is this idea of controlling the potential for struggle, the potential for conflict within its very own soul, within its very own self. And basically, here we can see why stasis plays such an important role in understanding why why there could have been so much conflict, all right, within the polis, like for example Athens, when we look at the history of Athens. So thank you very much. That is my conclusion. Hope that you enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Zammit, for that excellent lecture. Let me just